Welcome, everyone. My name is James Newell. I'm the director of the Depth Psychology Alliance, and today we're going to talk about Jung and the archetype of the wounded healer, and just what we're going to touch on some of the implications of that idea and that archetype, and along with that, expand into giving you some sort of overview of what we're going to touch on in the 8-week course that starts next week. Anyway, the archetype of the wounded healer is really an ideal model for understanding Jung's theory and for understanding how and why we dialogue with the unconscious in depth psychology. The wounded healer is really an essential model also for understanding the necessity of being aware of our own unconscious processes when we're working with others. This is particularly a ripe topic for people who are either therapists or personal coaches, or even just working in the world and trying to be helpful in any way. This dynamic and how it works, at least from the Jungian perspective, can give us some insights, I think, and that's what we're going to try to do today. Just to start out, I do want to say something about the Depth Psychology Alliance, why we offer these classes. Many of you may know Bonnie Bright, who first founded the Depth Psychology Alliance over 10 years ago. And right off, we noticed that aside from a few sort of high-end schools on the West Coast, most major universities do not offer courses on Jung. Psychology departments don't like Jung. There's all kinds of controversies and mainly, I would say, misunderstandings about Jung. In any case, he's not typically taught in schools. And so our goal has been twofold with these courses, is to fill that gap and provide people with college level courses that are affordable and available, and bring people. So you'll notice, like with this class in particular, there'll be some people you may know a lot about Jung. We've had even the Jungian analysts and people who are probably know more about Jung than I do taking these classes, and also people who are absolutely know nothing about Jung but are curious. So we try to, I'll define and talk about some things which some of you may already be familiar with, but that's just because we're trying to make it easy for a lot of people. Jung's psychology is not difficult to understand, but there are a lot of moving parts. There's a certain amount of jargon and things that, as with any field, if you're familiar with these things, you kind of gloss over them, but I'm going to try to not gloss over things. So if there's someone here who's absolutely new to Jung, we don't leave you in the dust. And if we do leave you in the dust, please do either ask a question during the class or save it to the discussion section. We'll try to straighten things out for you. So the second reason is simply to provide some funding for the Depth Psychology Alliance, because aside from occasional donations that we receive, these classes are really the only thing that keeps the Alliance going, and the website, and particularly the mailing list and all that, eats up a lot of cash. So we're trying to keep things running and keeping people connected to what's going on in the Depth Psychology Alliance community and the Depth Psychology community broadly. And thankfully, we have people from Australia, New Zealand, Europe, and of course, all over the United States who take part in the Alliance. So we're very happy that so many people are engaged. And we appreciate all of you for however you're engaged with the Alliance, and for your donations, and for taking part in these classes. That's makes it all worthwhile for us. So before I get to the meatier aspects of the class, I want to make a few general points about how we'll be approaching the idea of the archetype of the wounded healer. And also just to say that, I mean, I've got a lot of notes here. And in fact, the PowerPoint will be available for people who do sign up for the class. All the classes have PowerPoints and they're available to you. I mainly do this because, as with many people who are interested in a lot of things, do academic work, I could go on and on forever and get way off track. So it kind of keeps me focused. So I want to begin by saying that everything we do in this class and in the course that's upcoming is in the context of Jung's theory of individuation. That's really the overriding healing archetype that we use in Jungian psychology is individuation, and it's a process. It's not, as we like to say, it's as with people say with the spiritual path, it's not a destination, it's a journey, and the individuation process does not end. It's not like you get a certificate and you become individuated. It's something that's ongoing, and the ideal is for therapists, analysts, coaches, whoever, to empower people. And it's what we want to do with the Alliance and with these courses is empower people to be independent and to be able to do this work as much as they can. If it's, if you have serious trauma and other issues, naturally you want to work with other people. But the idea ultimately for Jung was always to empower people to work independently and maybe check in periodically and like that. So everything about Jung's theory revolves around this idea of individuation. This is what Marie-Louise von Franz has called the process of psychological maturation. And so throughout this class and throughout the course, I'm going to be interested in how our understanding of the archetype of the wounded healer contributes to each one of our own processes of individuation, as well as the process of individuation of people we may work with. And towards the end of the course, we'll also be looking at how individual development contributes to cultural development. Jung, and particularly Erich Neumann, talked about how it's the great individual who is able to, in a healthy way, carry an archetype that moves culture forward. So it's always the individual who is able to make big leaps, who helps culture broadly to make leaps as well. So what I want to do today is cover essentially 4 points, and these 4 points will be the basis for what we're talking about throughout the entire course over the next 8 weeks. Again, it's to sort of establish a baseline, and to, as well as for people who have no exposure to Jung and for these ideas, to give them a little, to give all of you a little bit of a sense of orientation. So the 4 main points I do want to clarify are going to be, as I said, individuation. I'm going to go into the individuation process from a classical Jungian perspective. We want to talk about the wound as initiation. This is sort of common throughout Jung's work, as he did not look at illness as necessarily, or as wounding, emotional wounding, as being a disease entity. He looked at it as an initiation into a process that opens us up to the unconscious, because we tend to be, in the modern world, dissociated and split off from the unconscious. So the wound is often something that kicks off an exploration of, or an initiation into this inner work. We're going to talk about archetypes of healing, or just the idea of healing within this context. And excuse me. And finally, and this is sort of the core and key of the whole thing about the wounded healer, is this idea of transference and the phenomena of projection, and particularly projection in the context of a helping relationship. So that's the basis of what we're going to do. And then finally, I want to explore and expand on these points and show you how we're going to explore and expand on these points in the upcoming course. So I'll go over the modules that we're going to do in the course, and that also will kind of give you some insight to, a broader look at the idea of the wounded healer. So obviously, the main question that we're going to be considering is, why are we interested in the wounded healer? As I've already said, the archetype of the wounded healer is in many ways an ideal model for understanding Jung's theory, for the understanding the process of individuation as a structured psychological maturation. And additionally, the archetype of the wounded healer provides a model for understanding this phenomena of projection in the helping relationship, which we call the transference and countertransference. And it shows us why it's important to be aware of our own wounds and our own unconscious processes, especially when we're working with others. It's always that's kind of the main focus in the individuation process in general, but it becomes particularly vital when working with other people. So any of you who know me or have taken any of these courses or seen some of the classes we have online knows that what I'm doing here in these courses is trying to present Jung as Jung wanted to be understood. And that is to say, from what we call the classical Jungian theory. There are many, many people who have taken Jung and gone in other places. They've gone some wonderful places, some questionable places. But what we want to do is be able to present people with the classical Jungian approach. And then from there, you can do your own research and decide which of these other approaches resonates for you. As I say, the idea is to empower people to go out and do their own research and to kind of take their own individual path in the direction that serves them, that serves you best. So starting out with my 4 points, I want to talk about the process of individuation. I'm going to go into a little bit now, and then at the close of the class, kind of broaden that out a little bit. From the perspective of classical Jungian psychology, we're, as I say, primarily interested in the process of individuation. In all classical Jungian psychology, whether we're talking about mythology or fairy tales or alchemy, or in this case, the archetype of the wounded healer, we want to know how exactly is an understanding of these structures, of these patterns, how is that going to help us in the path of individuation for ourselves and for working with other people. And that naturally begs the question, what exactly is individuation? And as I've said, according to Marie-Louise von Franz, it's the process of, or rather it's the structure of the process of psychological maturation, the patterns through which psychological maturation manifests. And there are typical patterns. We say that, oh, we're all individuals, and there's a saying that someone says, I'm unique, I'm individual, there's no one like me, just like everybody else. In other words, everybody can say, there's no one like me, I'm unique. Because of that thing that everybody is unique, then we can see the patterns and how the patterns of individuation tend to be within certain variations, tend to be very similar. So we could say briefly, just to start out, that there are two phases of the individuation process. And the first one is the requirement of social adaptation, the development of a strong and functional ego structure, as well as what Jung described as a persona or a persona complex. And you see in this little diagram here, we have the persona, which is how we meet the mask that we wear to meet the world outside. This is as the ego develops out of the unconscious. In this line here, you see it sort of demarcates between consciousness and unconscious. For Jung, there's a personal unconscious, which is all of our personal memories and things that have happened to us. And then there's the collective unconscious, which represents the patterns that are common in all, we could say the patterns that are actually existing in the central nervous system, and how they manifest and how they regulate certain amounts of psychological energy. So in order to do any of this work, in order to be working on the wounded healer, in order to open up into the next phase, we need to have a strong ego complex. You hear a lot of people saying, oh, ego's bad and we don't want to be egoists, and we don't want to be egoists, but we must at the same time have a strong personality structure, a strong sense of who we are, a strong sense of being grounded in the world before we can go into any depth in the unconscious, because otherwise we will just be overwhelmed. The weak, immature ego will just kind of dissolve when the unconscious sort of overwhelms it. And we'll talk about different ways that the unconscious does that. But the development of the persona and the development of a strong personality structure is what Jung calls the first phase of the individuation process. When in this process of developing the persona, those parts of the personality that do not fit easily into the persona fall into the unconscious and form what Jung is called the shadow or the shadow complex. There's a lot, I'm not going to go into complexes too much, but we often hear, oh, he has a mother complex, he has a father complex. Complexes aren't bad. They tend to be used pejoratively, but a complex is not a bad thing. We all have mother complexes and father complexes. When they block energy or cause energy to be stuck in certain places, then we have an issue. But the persona is a complex, the shadow is a complex, the ego itself is a complex. So the shadow complex forms around these elements that do not fit into the persona. As I'm a little boy growing up, I want my parents to think I'm a good little boy, and I don't let them know about the mischief that I'm doing. And so the mischief falls into the shadow. And as we get older, our mischief often gets worse, but we still try to keep it split off from, we don't want people to know about our mischief, whatever it is. So as we develop a strong ego structure, we're functioning well in the world. The second phase of psychological maturation, we often hear that Jung was mainly interested in the second phase of life. And this is the phase of life when people begin to recognize that something's out of sync, something's out of whack, and there's a crack in the persona, and that crack allows us access and encourages us to look at the shadow, to study what's going on in the unconscious, and to open up. Often the development of the persona blocks a lot of the free flow of energy from the unconscious. Our life energy is not, our creative energy is not flowing as we would like. So the second phase of life is opening up to that creative energy and opening up to the way that we can access first through the shadow some of these life energies that have been blocked by our external conformity, our conformity to the external world. So the initial experience of the shadow is usually an experience of wounding. And through accessing and healing this wounding, working on this wounding, we develop a relationship with the shadow. And ultimately, if we're successful, we develop and navigate and negotiate with the other deep structures of the unconscious. And these are what Jung called the archetypes of the collective unconscious. And again, we're not going to spend a lot of time going into archetypes. This is an example of some, the anima animus, the great mother, great father, the gods as energy, they're animal gods. And then we get down to the far end here where it's just pure, what Jung called psychic energy. Freud called it libido and said it was all sexual. Jung said, no, it's just life energy. All manner of energy is what informs these archetypes, and it's through the archetypes that the energy flows. So again, why are archetypes of the collective unconscious important? They're important because they become the mediators of this life energy, of this psychological energy. Jung called it psychic energy. I tend to avoid that a little bit because people think of the psychic hotline or clairvoyance. It's not about being psychic. Psychic simply means of the psyche. So it's psychological energy flows and is mediated by the archetypes. If we cannot maintain a relationship with the archetypes, then we either feel depressed and alienated from our own life energies. We have, if the energy is tied up in the archetypes and we have no access to that energy, then we are sort of dead and alienated and depressed. And when that happens, very often we cycle through. The archetypes don't cease to exist just because we're not in touch with them. And they tend to come up unbidden, and we become either identified with or possessed by, or as we say, inflated by these archetypal energies. And when that happens, that typically ends up creating significant life problems, including all kinds of social failures, compulsivity, addictions of various types, because we're not, when the autonomous complexes are being driven by the archetypes, and they have a higher energy charge than the charge of our conscious will. Often we come home from work and we may be able to function well during the day because we've taken all of our energy and drank a lot of coffee and we're focused. But then when we relax at the end of the day, that's when these archetypal energies have a higher charge than our will and our ego structure, and they can overrun things. So there's this cycling back and forth, and we'll talk more about this in a minute, but the cycling back and forth between this alienation from these energies, which leads to depression, or excuse me, the identification with them, or being inflated by these energies, which leads to a variety of anxiety disorders. So the way to avoid the pitfalls of either alienation from the psychological energies of the archetypes or inflation through identification with the archetypes, we want to develop an ongoing dialogue with the unconscious. And we do that by, Eric Neumann and Edward Edinger called it developing an ego self-axis. People like James Hillman and others talk about just having a soul life, the life of the soul, care of the soul. The idea is simply being in touch with these deep psychological energies. In ancient times, and for some people, even in the present day, people have managed these energies through religious practice, through spiritual disciplines and exercises. And the archetype of the self, as Jung would say, is experienced through the gods and the object of worship. And as long as we're involved and encased in that, what Jung would call that myth, the energies are contained and they're regulated, and we have a sort of a set of mores and ethics that we follow, and everything kind of runs smoothly. But for people who do not have that, this is where depth psychology comes in, and we develop a relationship with the unconscious directly rather than projected into an outer object. And then to say that as a part of that, we can also engage in various spiritual exercises and disciplines that also help to regulate those energies. But religious worship and spiritual discipline is essentially different from depth psychology, although depth psychology may very well, and I think for me personally, healthy depth psychology does include those things, but they're essentially different, because one is encased in the myth and the other is, as Marie-Louise von Franz would say, they encased in a different myth, which is the myth of Jungian psychology, or the myth of depth psychology. And until we get a better myth, that's the one that we use with depth psychology. So when we can regulate these energies and maintain this ego self-axis, that is to say, maintain and regulate the flow of life energy that is generated by the archetypes, we can be generative, we can be creative, we can apply these energies creatively to our life tasks, and we can enjoy a psychologically mature adulthood. Well, that's a sort of a very quick run through of what it sounds like. People often say, "Oh, I'm going to get individuated," and Jung compared the individuation process to crucifixion. So it can be a very, very painful thing. It's not a dance in the park, but it also can be very, very rewarding. But that is sort of a Cliff Notes, Reader's Digest, condensed version of the sort of classical Jungian approach to the understanding of psychological maturation, or the process of individuation. So with that as the background, all the other work around and thinking about Jung and the wounded healer is in the sort of the context of that myth, I'll say, of that idea of the individuation process. So moving on to the next point I want to make is the idea of the wound as an initiation. And this business of moving from the persona building phase of the individuation process to the integration of the shadow and the exploration of the unconscious is typically initiated by some kind of wounding. So that's one place where the wound comes in. The persona has to crack. It has to be seen to be incomplete in order to make room for all of these rejected contents that have ended up in the shadow. And this is always experienced as a defeat by the ego, and requires the conscious ego to take stock now of what's in the unconscious. If I don't do it deliberately and one-pointedly, then the unconscious will see to it that that I take the unconscious seriously. The unconscious will continue creating situations where wounding occurs. Now, many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Jung's book, Symbols of Transformation, where he describes some of these ideas in terms of the archetype of the hero. And I'm sure even more of you are familiar with the mythologist Joseph Campbell, who expanded on Jung's ideas in his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and in his concept of the hero's journey. And in Campbell's model, the call to adventure is often experienced as some sort of mishap. It can be a divorce or being fired or an automobile accident or alcoholism, just any kind of thing, but some kind of exterior. It feels like exterior, but it's driven by the unconscious. And this is the call to adventure. And it's sort of like in many initiatory rituals, some sort of actual or symbolic, symbolic wounding is enacted. In shamanic initiation, the initiate often experiences an illness of some type, which is not resolved until the individual can begin to practice shamanic exercises. In other words, instead of being the wounding coming up from behind, the shaman turns and begins to practice, usually drumming or something. And when they get better from all this drumming and this shamanizing, as some of them call it, then the community recognizes them as being a healer, and they become they have a role in the community as a healer. And this idea of a wounded healer is often a given, although it's not always that way. There's something we'll talk. I'm going to talk a lot more about it in the course. But in religious studies, there's two categories. In anthropology, there are two categories of religious specialists. And one is a shamanic religious specialist who has a direct experience of revelation, and the other is the priestly, who is basically, I would say it's a parallel to this idea of the persona, where it deals with and is related to external conformity. The priestly caste tends to try to commemorate the revelation of a shamanic figure. And there are many, we could go through lists and lists of world religions where this has been the case. But I bring it up here because in shamanic situations and in all of these different types of wounded healer configurations that we'll talk about, there tends to be there are people who are right in the fire of revelation, and the revelation comes out and they have to kind of wrestle with it. And then there are people who are more conforming to a revelation that they've heard before. And this is what we call the priestly caste. But in any of those, however we think about it, this idea of the hero's journey and the call to adventure and the experience of healing from that process is often embarked upon after the wounding has occurred. Now, this is not always true, because actually, as we'll see, for example, with Chiron, Jesus of Nazareth, these are individuals who had a healing career and then were profoundly wounded. So sometimes, although many people enter the healing profession in order to heal their wounds, it's also true that if we go into the world or enter a situation to be a helper of some kind, I don't even say healer, but a helper of some kind, it's a given that at some point we will be wounded. We will, in the same way that people decided to crucify Jesus, in the same way that Chiron got wounded by the arrows of Hercules, and many, many other cases, the act of helping brings on a wound. And this is closely related to this idea of the transference and the countertransference. And that's something we'll talk about in a lot more detail. So often people embark on the healing profession because they have this wound to begin with. They want to, any of the helping professions, they want to heal their own wounds, so they educate themselves about it and find they have some skill there. And this is certainly true. For example, so there are many studies of social workers and therapists and counselors, where a significant percentage of the individuals who've been studied report that they entered into the helping profession because they wanted to address their own personal wounds, their own dysfunctional childhood, their own abuse, et cetera, et cetera. So that's certainly one aspect of the wounded healer. But as we'll see as we go through, particularly when we get into the transference, countertransference, often the wounding happens after someone has engaged in the healing or the helping profession. So that brings us to the question of healing itself. We're talking about wounding and wounded healers, but what is the what's sort of the framework for healing? As I said, the main overarching for Jungians, the main overarching healing archetype is this framework of individuation that I kind of raced through. There's a lot more to it, and we talk about a lot of it in the course, but that's the overriding one for Jungians. But if we're going to talk about that, we also want to talk about just sort of general healings. Now, in many places, you may see on the internet and elsewhere that Jung, they say Jung coined the phrase "the wounded healer." I've looked everywhere, and if any of you have seen this somewhere, where in print with Jung, I looked in the index to the collected works, I looked in the index to psychological, Jung speaking, a lot of different places, searched the internet everywhere. I've never found any place where Jung actually used the term wounded healer. However, he does say wounded physician, as he does in this quote here. He says, quote, this is Carl Jung from the collected works. I think it's his volume on psychotherapy. He says, quote, we could say without too much exaggeration that a good half of every treatment that probes at all deeply consists in the doctor's examining himself. For only what he can put right in himself can he hope to put right in the patient. It is no loss either if he feels that the patient is hitting him or even scoring off him. It is his own hurt that gives the measure of his power to heal. This and nothing else is the meaning of the Greek myth of the wounded physician. So he says physician, not wounded healer. And I think that's significant. I also want to point out, when we're quoting Jung, a lot of these things were written in the 20s and 30s, and it was simply the norm for many centuries to always use the masculine pronoun. Gender pronouns would be masculine. Sometimes when I'm reading them, I like to switch them up. But he did it that way. It would have been very unnatural for him to not do it that way. His work has certainly had a lot to do with people wanting to integrate more inclusive pronoun use, but in his work he didn't. So I hope you'll forgive me for just plowing through that without too much reference to it. But so Jung talks about a wounded physician, not a wounded healer. And I think one reason he does that, he avoids the term healer, because the word itself is problematic, especially from this Jungian healing, the individuation, the idea of this overarching idea of individuation as a healing metaphor. Because Jung did not see himself as someone who accomplished the healing of his patients. He always said of healing and individuation that it was an individual affair, and as such, the catalyst must emerge from inside the patient's own psyche, from the individual's own psyche. That's the word. The word individuation implies exactly that it's the development of an individual, someone who is not simply conforming to external mores and external rules, but is somehow in dialogue with them, certainly has the skills to conform, but also recognizes their own individuality and brings that to bear on these external realities. So it has to come from the patient themselves. And if not, there will be no lasting resolution of the presenting problem or of the wound that the patient or the client or the person who's come for help. There'll be no resolution if the resolution ultimately does not come from within the person. And there's another quote from Jung in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. He says, quote, so much is said in the literature about the resistance of the patient that it would almost seem as if the doctor were trying to put something over on him, whereas the cure ought to grow naturally out of the patient himself. Psychotherapy and analysis are as varied as are human individuals. I treat every patient as individually as possible because the solution of the problem is always an individual one. So for Jung, it's not the helper who does the healing. Healing is a natural process that results from certain conditions being met. And just as an example, if we think, for example, of a cut on the hand, just a common burn or cut, healing in that case results from first removing any pollutants. That means cleaning the cut. Second, creating and maintaining a contained environment in which healing can take place. And that's maybe bandaging the wound after it's been cleaned, putting some salve or ointment on it. And then 3, patiently waiting for the natural energies of growth of the body to accomplish the work of healing. And that's, of course, an oversimplification, but it provides sort of a, I would say, an archetype for how Jungian understanding of individuation works as well. We want to remove any negative influences. If someone's in an abusive situation, we want to remove this abusive influence from the person. We want to create and maintain an environment in which the healing can take place, in which the person can talk about what's been going on and can process all the different influences of that. And of course, with Jung in particular, talk about dreams as a way to reconnect with the unconscious. And then finally, it's a very, this is not a take a pill and you're better the next day process. It requires patiently waiting for the natural energies of the growth of the individual to slowly metabolize and integrate these things from the unconscious and make things work. So this is quoting here Anthony Stevens, who is the author of the textbook that we're going to use for the full course, his book, The 2 Million-Year-Old Self. But he says, God heals is an old saying, of course. God heals and the physician takes the fee. And it's the job of the helper to be more of a midwife than someone who actually intervenes. This is I'm going in now to just describing Jung's understanding of healing and how that will happen and how it's best understood. There's a lot more to it, and we'll spend a lot more time on that as we go through the different archetypes of the wounded healer, which again, I'm going to discuss that in just a couple of minutes. The different things we'll cover in the course. So the next point I wanted to talk about, the final point, is this idea of transference and projection. And as I said, many of you, of course, are aware of the idea of projection. But just in case you're not, I want to quickly go over just the ideas. So the core sense of how the transference works can be understood. So projection is not necessarily a bad thing. It can be a help or a hindrance in the process of individuation, in the process of psychological maturation and healing, depending on how consciously we deal with it. By definition, projection is unconscious, but if we deal with it consciously, if we can recognize it, it can be an enormous help. And sort of historically, we could say that projection is a psychological defense mechanism. It was identified probably by others, but certainly made very well known by Sigmund Freud, and something that Jung signed on to himself very enthusiastically, and is a very important part of Jung's work. So what happens is when the psyche encounters something unknown, a certain amount of anxiety is created, and the unconscious digs around frantically to try to find something familiar that it has experienced before that will explain this unknown thing. And as the psyche sort of spontaneously and unconsciously digs around for these things, it eventually hits on something that looks similar. It's a pattern that's familiar. And when that pattern sort of pops up, it is then immediately projected outside the person. And the unconscious sort of tells you, that's what it is. It's a woman behaving this way. It must be like your mother. So the projection of the mother image pops up. And there's all kinds of, as you can see with this diagram, there's all kinds of different ways that projections, this is for the ideas of a child, but it works, continues to work as we get older. It can be projected onto people, onto things, onto situations. And as I say, it has a lot to do with practically everything that happens in culture. And we certainly have a lot of unconscious projection going on in our culture these days, and as it has been doing for thousands of years. But the importance of this in the context of what we're talking about as the wounded healer is that the projection is tricky in life at all times, but when we get it into a situation of the helping relationship, it becomes very, very difficult, and it takes a lot of highly skilled and very sort of subtle tact to work through it in the helping relationship. So in general, in Jungian psychology, we're always advised to be aware of shadow projection. We just talked about the shadow and how that Jung has said, and I think most Jungians recognize that most of the time the unconscious is experienced through projection. We project, we assume something about what's going on out there, and something happens where we realize, oh, wait a minute, that wasn't that person, it was my own expectation. And we become aware, we become a little more conscious when we can, Eric Neumann says the projection is sort of fragmented, and a little bit at a time we can assimilate it and make it conscious. We little by little, we make these things conscious. So we project the shadow, we project the anima animus, which is the opposite. Typically, we project the shadow onto the same sex figure and the anima animus onto opposite sex. These days, with gender fluidity, I like to say that it's simpler, rather than just say anima is the feminine side of a man. However I identify in terms of gender consciously, then the anima animus, so-called, is going to be the opposite of that. So again, I'm not going to get into a lot of that, but this phenomena of all these kinds of projections, when it happens in the healing relationship, becomes much more complicated and problematic. And as we can see with this diagram, there's at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different relationships going on there. Client and therapist meet each other. They have a conscious relationship, but their expectations of the client onto the therapist, their expectations of the therapist onto the client, and all these things get jumbled up. Now, that sounds like a mess, and it can be a mess, but if we have the skill and the patience and the determination to work through that, some of the greatest insights in a safe environment with a skillful therapist and a hardworking, I don't want to say client, or there's all these different terms for someone who comes for help, but with all of those things working, some of the most important emotional and psychological growth can happen through the resolution of this transference phenomena. Because in addition to the client's complexes, the mother imagos, the father imagos, and the other projections, at some point, often early in the relationship, the client is going to project onto the healer the potential for healing, which the client hopes to receive from the helper. There's some kind of help that I think I can't muster it myself, but I believe that it's in you, that you can help me. Now, ultimately, and again, going by this model of the Jungian idea of healing, the therapist or the helper isn't really the one that's going to accomplish that at all, and doesn't really, I mean, hopefully the person has a lot of skills, but ultimately the person who projects this healing onto the helper is going to realize that this person is not going to heal me. But when that happens, hopefully, ideally, at some point, the client will recognize that the potential for healing resides within themselves, and that the helper is there only to sort of help the process along, like a midwife, not actually to accomplish the healing itself. Now, getting to that point through this transference phenomena can be tricky, and a lot of clients don't make it that far. They get mad at the therapist and they storm off, or maybe they'll go away for a couple months and then come back and kind of work things through. But it's the job of the helper to be as aware of those processes as possible, to be, as Jung says, to kind of hold their own projections in at bay as much as they can. When the time is right, they may be able to change them, but it's not the client's job to take care of the therapist. The therapist is there to help the client. And if the therapist is triggered by the client, then it's the therapist's job to have supervision of some kind, to have someone that they go to, and that they're always doing their own work to kind of resolve that. It's never up to the client to take care of the emotional needs of the therapist. So with that said, it's, even though that what I just said is true, it's very important that the helper also have an investment in the relationship, and that the helper has an actual human relationship with the client, and not just as we'll talk about later, an Asclepius complex or something where the therapist thinks that they are a god who's going to be there, and the client has to kind of respond to them, and they don't have any personal relationship. And here's a quote from Jung about that. He says, quote, "The crucial point is that I confront the patient as one human being to another. Analysis is a dialogue demanding two partners. Analyst and patient sit facing one another." And he emphasizes this because this is different from Freud, who had, of course, person turned away and lying on a couch. Jung said, no, analyst and patient sit facing one another, eye to eye. The doctor has something to say, but so has the patient. And Jung tells of a dream where, I don't remember exactly, I think the dream was that he saw himself looking, that this client was a giant in the dream, and he was very small, and he had to look up to the patient. And Jung understands dreams as being compensatory, as being compensations. And when he woke up, he realized, he thought, well, why would I be looking up like that? And he realized that he had been looking down at the patient. This is a compensation. This is a reversal. He had actually been looking down at the patient, and this helped him to, there was a peasant woman or someone who he was not meeting eye to eye like this. And so he adjusted his attitude, and the relationship and the healing of the client went much better when he stopped sort of discounting her. So the client comes to the helper because he or she has a wound, but the helper also has a wound. If the helper unconsciously projects their wound into the helping relationship, it can cause significant problems in the relationship. Jung always admonished his students to be acutely aware of this challenge. And he says, this is another quote from him. He says, "The therapist must at all times keep watch over himself, over the way he is reacting to his patient. For we do not react only with our consciousness. We must always be asking ourselves, how is our unconscious experiencing this situation? We must therefore observe our dreams, pay the closest attention, and study ourselves just as carefully as we do the patient. Otherwise, the entire treatment may go off the rails," end quote. So this, as I said already, working towards a positive resolution of this transference and countertransference. Again, the transference is what the patient projects onto the helper, and the countertransference is what the helper projects onto the client. But this resolution can be really one of the most important tasks encountered in the helping relationship. And when resolved, then we have two people on a common ground, working towards building a higher consciousness, and working towards both individuals working toward maintaining this ego self axis, this flowing energy between the conscious ego and the deep recesses of the conscious, the unconscious, the soul work that James Hillman talks about. So a working familiarity with the nuances of the mythological patterns associated with the archetype of the wounded healer will be of great benefit to anyone in working with others on their emotional issues for exactly this reason. It's this awareness of the wound and how the wound contributes to healing, or may block and inhibit healing if we're not aware of it. That's the key to the whole business, really. So what I've done now, we talked about 4 key points that sort of, they're kind of assumptions that underline everything we're going to be doing in the course. First is the sort of the general model of the individuation process. The second is this idea of the wound as an initiation, and this is kind of a part and parcel of the third point, which is the idea of healing being something that is a natural growth process rather than some sort of disease agent, as we get to with a medical model. And not to say that in certain cases in medical situations, treating the disease agent is essential, but it's different when we're talking about psychological issues. And so, and then finally, and so the key element of this whole wounded healer mode that we're talking about is this transference phenomena and the projection within the helping relationship, which is the essence of transference and countertransference. So what we're going to do through this course is to continue to integrate each of these ideas throughout each module of the course, focusing a little bit on different aspects as we go along. We've got, it's going to go through that in detail in just a second, but there's shamans, there's the sort of the Hippocratic mode of healing, which is a little more priestly. There's the sort of the gods are healers, but the gods are not specialists. They're not the same as the archetypes. So we're going to talk about this sort of broader thing of that. And in each one of these, it's not just like a history lesson about how people thought this and that. We're going to bring it back, tie it back in with how this relates to this individuation process. This is always the ongoing thing, is how does this work in terms of individuation? And essentially, we're going to present the course in 2 parts. The first half, that is to say, the first 4 modules, it's 8 modules. The first half is going to focus on historical manifestations of the archetype of the wounded healer and how each of these relates to the individuation process. And in the second half, now see, when Jung would talk about translating, or rather interpreting a dream or a fairy tale or anything like that, it was always essential, once you get sort of the patterns and the archetypes and all that, it's essential to translate it into psychological language that relates directly to the individual situation, particularly with a dream. It has to relate to the individual situation. So what we want to do in the second half of the course is work on translating these broad archetypal patterns into psychological language and into the sort of practical techniques and the practical way of approaching the transference phenomena in sort of the relation to these archetypal patterns that we studied in the first half of the course. So the now one of the I think I mentioned this, the textbook we're going to use in the course is a book by Anthony Stevens called The 2 Million Year Old Self. It's an excellent book. I thought there are many possible books that I wanted to use. And again, this is only for people who want to go further into it. We try to make this available. If you want to just audit the course, you can do that. If you want to go more deeply and read some of the materials, we're going to have materials on the online learning platform. And if you want to go even further, you can get a certificate of completion where you finish some assignments and there's discussion groups and things like that. If you do all that, you'll need to have the textbook, which is the 2 Million Year Old Self. There's a great book called The Wounded Healer by David Sedgwick, but and I thought about that for a while, but it's really all about clinical transference, countertransference stuff. It doesn't get much into the archetypal stuff. There are other books that are all archetypal, like books on Asclepius and things like that. Books on shamans. There's some wonderful books by Joan Halifax on shamanism, but that's all sort of on the archetypal religious level. So Stevens does an excellent job, I think, of bringing all of these things together. So that's the textbook. And why did I bring up all that? Because yeah, we're gonna talk about that, and then in the final two modules of the course, we're going to focus on the cultural manifestations of the patterns of wounding and healing and how they reflect contemporary cultural forms in relation to the wounded healer, in relation to this business of the shamanic aspect of it and the ego self axis and the patterns of that and how we see these things manifest in culture and how our own, to the degree any of us may be activists or interested in bringing more consciousness into the world, that's kind of where we're going to be going with that. So how I'm approaching the first half, I just want to quickly run through. We got a few more minutes. This is a diagram from, I've actually altered it, but it's from Edward Edinger's book, Ego and Archetype. And this is sort of the individuation process in short. So when the ego is completely encased in itself, completely unconscious, there's a little bit of consciousness here. See, it's still connected to the archetype of the self, still connected to the unconscious, a little bit more conscious. Now here, we have pretty much full differentiation, but it's no longer connected to the roots of the being. It's dissociated. And then here, we have the ideal where there's a differentiation. For Jung, progress always is differentiation of the conscious from the unconscious. And here we have differentiation and the ego self axis, which keeps the unconscious and the conscious, keeps this energy flow, the regulation of the archetypal energies constantly flowing between. It's a dialogue. It's not just the ego tells the self what to do. It's not just that the unconscious tells the ego what to do. There's a dialogue that is ongoing and continues to be ongoing. It's not like, okay, I've done that and now I'm going to go do something else. This is something that goes on for the rest of our lives, ideally. But this pattern also shows that there's been a similar level of cultural development that throughout history, we could see it through the same pattern. And I want to show you that here. Well, wait a minute, where did I go? Okay, yeah. So before I get to that, the idea of the hero's journey is this idea where there's the call to adventure, the wounding, there's a sort of an alienation experienced, then there's a reconnection and bringing up of the boon back to the regular world. And this hero, there's the departure, the initiation, the return. This is the pattern of the hero's journey that we talked about earlier. That's talking about it in a metaphorical way. When we talk about it in a psychological way, in psychological language, we talk about a sense of just sort of being ourselves and what they call passive inflation, the original wholeness, the sense of having an identity. But if the archetypal energies overwhelm the ego, then we have what we call an active inflation. And in this active inflation creates an inflated or an heroic act, which is what we were calling the call to adventure, this initiation through a wounding, some kind of events happens. Now, that leads to this alienation, the dismemberment, the complete sort of collapse of what one thought one was. The sense of identity is collapsed, and one becomes humble, repentant, and develops a sacrificial attitude. And through that, one gets in touch with who one actually is, the actual resources that are available to one. And that's you could say, the treasure that we bring back into consciousness. And this cycle goes on and on. This is a cycle that we develop throughout life. And as we do that more and more, that's how this differentiation happens. We go through cycles of identification and alienation, each time differentiating a little bit. And that can be seen cross-culturally as well. We could say that from the Stone Age, from about 3.5 million years ago to the mid-Neolithic, about 5,000 years ago, people were living in a pretty much completely unconscious, instinctual, just survival mode. From the Neolithic, is when, then we should say, really women discovered agriculture and developed agriculture. This is very much a feminine discovery. The hunter-gatherers would go out hunting and gathering, and the women noticed that as they would, who were typically the gatherers, they noticed that where the seeds dropped, new life came. Where the dead plants were, new life came out of it. And little by little, people developed agriculture. With agriculture, all kinds of civilization developed, specialization developed. Then a little bit more conscious, a little bit less instinctual behavior from about 100 BCE to the late medieval period. Civilization is growing more. And around and after the Enlightenment period, this modern dissociated state where people are completely cut off. There's a sense of positivism that science is going to answer everything, and we want to cut off and forget about our animal nature. We're not animals at all. We don't have any instincts. This is the idea. This is a very dangerous, dangerous place, because this is where the inflation comes and the archetypes come and overwhelm the ego and possess the ego. And we have a very difficult time with it. Just as we said with the individual, mishaps happen. Well, we have huge, massive cultural mishaps happen. Ideally, we want culturally and otherwise to have this ego self-axis working with us being not unconscious, or at least less unconscious than we had previously been. Now, in each of these phases, there were always people who were highly developed. These are the great individuals. Eric Neumann describes them as great individuals who are able to carry the archetype without being identified with it and without being possessed by it. And they provide an example to people culturally, so this development can happen. It's always great individuals who move culture forward. And so when we're going through the course, particularly the first half of the course, when I go through the shamanic and all these things, we're going to be, and this is going to lead up to the final class where we talk about the cultural implications. That's just wanted to show you that, show that there is a method to the madness here. It's not just sort of a random bringing together of things. So I'm going to quickly, I've already gone over my time. I'm going to quickly just run through what the 4 modules are going to be. The first module, we're going to look at the archetype of the wounded healer. As I said, we're going to do 4 modules on looking at these archetypal forms, and then 4 looking at how they play into the transference. The first one is the shaman as the ideal prototype of the wounded healer. The shaman either ascends up a ladder or up a tree of life, or goes down into the depths, and you can see how that is a sort of a metaphor for the ego self-axis, accessing the unconscious. We'll look at that, and we'll also begin to look at this dichotomy that I talked about the shamanic versus the priestly, and how that manifests in healers, both in tribal and earlier cultural groups. Next module, we're going to look at the classical Greek manifestations of the wounded healer and the mythology of Apollo, who is more of a god than a specific healer, then Chiron, who is really the first healer, and he taught Asclepius and others. And Asclepius will be probably the main focus. He's the only god to remain primarily on Earth, helping to heal humans. He's also the only god to experience death. And there's lots of nuances with Asclepius that are very, very key to sort of the next level. After the shamanic level has really got sort of a bare bones archetypal form, and then Asclepius is kind of very much in the civilized world, but still in the realm of the gods and of the mythology. And we'll also look at the sort of priestly level of this Greek development. You know, the Greeks were great thinkers, and this is where hypocrisy came. It's not hypocrisy, Hippocrates and the Hippocratic Oath. We'll look at that and how that represents sort of a priest. We have Asclepius as more or less a shaman type, and Hippocrates as a priestly manifestation of the same idea of the healer. I don't want to go too fast, but I'm already over it. I want to leave lots of time for discussion. I appreciate all you guys wading through all this with me. So then we're going to look at the healing gods of the ancient world, from Apis of the Egyptians and Ishtar and Marduk of the Babylonians, to the Ahriman of the Persians, etc., etc. Now, being gods like Apollo, they have many responsibilities. They're healers, but they also are lawgivers, and they have political and social responsibilities as well. So they weren't focused exclusively on that, but there are particular ways in which they each deal with health and healing, and often the wounding part for these gods is that they will wound their devotees if they don't stay in line. So we'll look at those, as well as, again, throughout this, we're going to relate them to how does this connect us to this idea of culture, and this idea of the individuation process as it works through culture. And then I want to spend one module on the Greek god Orpheus and the role of music in healing. Very often this isn't mentioned at all, but from the shamanic drumming to religious worship to the Asclepian healing centers, music was a huge part of all these healing processes. And I see music as a symbol for the numinous, what Jung called the numinous, which is the charge, the psychological sacred charge that comes off of the archetypes. So, and there's some very particular aspects of the Orphic myth and the Orphic cults that inform us a lot about healing, and how this numinous energy represented by music works in a healing way. So then with module 5 through 8, we're going to be talking about translating these things into the sort of the clinical realm, the modern realm, starting with Freud and Jung, and how they were both wounded and used their wounds as a part of developing their own healing practices. And Jung, of course, in particular, his whole healing practice developed through his healing work. He developed active imagination, which is a very, very important aspect of his work. And we'll talk a lot about that in module 5. Module 6, we're going to get right down to the many, many clinical aspects of the transference and the countertransference, and just how Jung teased that out. He used an alchemical text, the Rosarium Philosophorum, to sort of outline his ideas about transference and countertransference. But he also had a lot to say just conversationally, and in a number of different ways that it's very, very informative and very helpful for anybody working in this context. It just really broadens our ideas, and it brings all of this earlier sort of archetypal level view of that into focus. And then number 7, module 7, we're going to look at contemporary institutional healing and the Asclepius, the Asclepius complex. And the Asclepius complex is just this, Asclepius got into trouble because he was bringing people back from the dead. So he took healing a little too far. He was inflated. And we see that in a lot of certainly medical, pharmaceutical, and other areas of culture, and how that relates to the kind of work that we do as Jungians. And all of that I'm going to get into with module 7, and how that relates to alienation and inflation. As I say, inflation is related to this Asclepius complex. And then finally, in module 8, we're going to look at the practical applications of everything we've learned in the course, and discussing ways that we can begin to work consciously with the archetype of the wounded healer in ourselves and in our work and in culture at large. And as I say, I've got a lot more to say. I often have a lot more to say than I have time to say. If you decide you want to take the course, as I know many of you have already signed up, and thank you for that. The videos will be available if you can't show up for every Saturday afternoon. It'll be at the same time as this every week. You'll have an access to the PowerPoint you can download from the online platform. And then we will have a lot of additional research and articles available to you if you want to learn more. If you want to just audit, you can do that. Or if you want to earn a certificate, you can take some, there can be a couple of quizzes and a paper at the end. And that's it. The course is going to begin next week, Saturday, October 16th, 1 p.m. Pacific time to It'll be an hour, same thing as this. It'll be an hour with, and then half hour or so of discussion, however much you want to discuss. And that's 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. And thank you all. If you've got any questions, I'm going to unshare my screen. And please, I hope somebody's got some thoughts. Doesn't have to be a question you can share, or just ask a question. I see someone in the chat says, in the psychology of the transference, Jung used the Rosarium Philosophorum. Yeah. I may have missed this part, but if not, can you mention or help me understand how that correlates to this process? Yeah, we talk. Who is this who's asking this? Is Leah? Are you there, Leah, still? I see you. Can you unmute?
Yes.
Yes. So what was your question?
Just, I'm unclear about the correlation between the 15th century woodcuts, the alchemical process that he laid all of this out on, and so I might have missed.
Sure. No, it is confusing. Are you familiar with Jung's work in alchemy? Do you know kind of where he's coming from with that?
Just starting to. That's why I'm looking for more info.
Well, he kind of takes a lot for granted that you already have read, like, for example, Psychology and Alchemy. And that's one of the easier, the middle part of Psychology and Alchemy is one of the easier ways to get into his work. The easiest way, I think, might be Edward Edinger's book, Anatomy of the Psyche. That's a very, lot of, now that's for alchemy, not for this aspect of it being the transference. But the idea of the transference is that he, in the Rosarium Philosophorum, it's a text that is talking about the alchemical process. So this is bizarre to begin with, because he's talking about people with alembics and tubes and heating and chemicals, and they would look at these things and they would project their own inner processes into what they would imagine that this is what's going on with the chemicals. And to represent them, they would represent them metaphorically with, for example, the idea is to remove certain substances, bring certain substances together, and create something new. It's a transformative process. So he would have a man and a woman. This is the two substances. They come together, but instead of just creating a child, as a man and woman would do when they come together, they actually become hermaphrodite. They actually are joined together themselves. And in the process, there's a spirit that goes up to a cloud and comes back down and fecundates all this. So there's all this symbolic language about how one projects and there's a book, Marie-Louise von Franz's Projection and Recollection. I don't recommend that necessarily as the best book on understanding the process, but because I'm using the phrase, I'm mentioning it. But it's about projection and recollecting in other words, bringing back the projection. I projected something onto you. I think it's you, but then I recognize, oh, that wasn't you at all. You're very different. This is all about me. This is all about my memories of my mother. It's about my own archetypal thing. So all of that is represented symbolically in this series of woodcuts. And he's, again, it's tied up with his understanding of alchemy, which, I've done whole courses on alchemy, so I'm not going to be able to explain all that there. Does that clarify that a little?
It helps a bit. Yes. Thank you so much.
Yeah. I also, when wanting to know about transference, opened up Rosarium Philosophorum very innocently and was completely lost, because it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense right off the bat if you don't have all this background in alchemy.
Right.
So yeah, that's it. If you were confused by that, you're not alone. There are many, many others.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Sure. Thanks for asking.
Thank you. This is awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks. Would the course be running again? I can't make this one coming out. Well, what we're doing with all these courses is I'm doing I'm doing videos, not the live videos, but doing videos and putting them on depthpsychologyacademy.com. We've got two courses. One, certainly, I probably won't announce them until in the spring, but we've got Jung 101 and Jung 102, and I'm going to be doing Dreams and Active Imagination will be available in the spring. as on-demand courses that you can just download anytime or watch anytime. And then this one will be available eventually, but not for a while. It'll take a while. Please mention the textbook again. The textbook is Anthony Stevens's book, The 2 Million Year Old Self. It's an excellent, excellent book. I highly recommend it. It's whether you're interested in this topic or not. It really, he ties in Jung's theory. He explains Jung's theory very well, but he also ties it in with a lot of modern science and evolutionary theory, and particularly attachment theory. He worked with John Bowlby, who developed attachment theory, and he just connects those two very well. He does it in more detail in a book called Archetype, Natural History of the Self, but this book, 2 Million Year Old Self, is kind of a cliff notes of that. It's a lot easier. It's a very pleasant read, pretty easy to read, and it has a lot about healing archetypes, and wounding. He got to talk. There's a chapter called the healing wound. So as I said, I was thinking even of the Rosarium Philosophorum as a textbook, and I thought, gee, this will just drive some people nuts. So I decided not on that. And for a while, I really was going to go with this book, The Wounded Healer by David Sedgwick, which it's an excellent book, but again, it's very much tied up in clinical stuff. And I know a lot of people, particularly people just auditing because they want to just enjoy learning about this stuff, could easily get lost with that. If you're a clinician and you really want to know a lot about that, David Sedgwick's book is a great one. But anyways, I decided finally to go with the textbook. Yes, someone asks, the 2 Million Year Old Self, Anthony Stevens. Yes, that is correct. Let's see. Thank you, James. Grateful for the DPA's therapeutic teachings. I'll be auditing this one, very much still intending to complete the 7-course certificate program. It's actually 8-course, but I'm glad. Dave, thanks for that. And any questions about that, let me know. Is there information about the 7-course certificate program on the website? Again, it's an 8-course. It's not 7-course. It's an 8-course certificate program. And I haven't really, we marketed it a lot when we started doing it live. And I did this all kind of at the sort of the instigation of Bonnie. I was telling Bonnie Bright, my wife does yoga and ran a bunch of yoga certification programs. And I said, Bonnie, you want to do this? You should start a certification program. And I kept telling her this, and because she was trying to she is running through a lot of money on the Depth Psychology Alliance and couldn't afford it. And I said, well, this would be an easy way. Anyways, she eventually talked me into doing it. I was trying to talk her into doing it. She talked me into doing it. And we're doing it live. And at that point, we promoted it a lot so people would sign up for that. And we did graduate many people. Bill, I see Bill Dunn is on here. I think that he got his certification through that. And I have not been promoting it recently because it's taking a long time to put all these together in a way. I don't want to be promising something that I can't deliver. So it's as I say, we'll have 4 done by the spring, and I hope by the end of next year to have the remaining 4 done. I'm going to try to. I may not quite make it, but we're just trying to get that all together. Once that's done, then we'll be putting a lot on the website about the 8-course certificate, and it's a certification as a specialist in depth psychology, and it's mainly meant for people who are already. It's not a licensure. It doesn't give you any. It doesn't even give you continuing education points. It's just for people who are already working in the mental health field. And as I say, no one is teaching this stuff. So we want to make it available and have at least some kind of credential that people could have that show that they're skilled and knowledgeable about depth psychology. And we really do go into a lot of detail and a lot of good resources. And this course and the next course in the spring is going to be Jung and the arts, creativity and the arts. And the last one we did was on astrology, and the one before that was on Christianity. And Jung did lots and lots of work on both of those. on all of these things. And this is going to be sort of the advanced certificate. These 4 will be the advanced certificate. So that, anyways, that's the reason we're not promoting it more at the moment, is simply because, as I say, I don't want to get people all interested in something that's not yet available. But believe me, we will be letting you know about it as soon as it is available. And of course, if you want to start, we do already have courses up there ready to go. Jung 101, Jung 102, and by spring we'll have Jung and Dreams and Jung and Active Imagination. Those are the first 4 courses. Then we'll have mythology, fairy tales, alchemy, and history of depth psychology is kind of the capstone course. So do you think that Jung's many archetypes are the only ones, or just the main ones, or neither? Well, that's a good question. Many people think, and Jungians generally accept that there's the archetype of the self, which is sort of the central organizing. And let me just clarify one thing about archetypes. When we talk about archetypes, Jung always said it was the hypothesis. You can't cut open someone's brain and find an archetype. There's no archetype of the self to be found through anatomy or anything like that. These are metaphorical ways of talking about subjective experience. And clearly there is, just as there's a nucleus to an individual cell, there's also a nucleus to more advanced life forms, and including human beings. And Jung described the subjective experience of this nucleus of the human being as being the archetype of the self. It's you could call it an epiphenomena of the central nervous system. So all of the other archetypes, my understanding of all of the other archetypes, are different sort of fragmented, we can only experience the archetype of the self in fragmented form. And so we experience it first through the parental imagos. So there's the father and mother. We experience it culturally through pretty much any experience that is constantly repeated throughout human history, and that's universal in all different cultures and all different forms. Pretty much all of those are going to be archetypal forms, but most Jungians understand them to be sort of fragmented, what someone can encounter at any given time, aspects of the archetype of the self. So yeah, I mean, and to say they're Jung's archetypes isn't exactly right. He says that they're pre-existing. They're not things that he invented. They're things that he observed. And when we say observed, well, how did he observe them? Well, for Jung, dreams are very, very real. It's speculated, I think Marie-Louise von Franz said that Jung probably interpreted over 80,000 dreams. For Jung, dreams were very, very real, and they were very, very much a mirror of what's going on in the psyche, individually for individuals, but also for humankind. There are these archetypal patterns that are common cross-culturally. So he observed in dreams these same patterns coming up over and over again. And this is one reason why intellectuals often, because they're not familiar with this, working with the unconscious and working with dreams, they think that Jung is regressive and he's going back to being a pre-modern person. And in fact, he's just the opposite. He's incorporating aspects of the human experience that scientists tend to eliminate. It's the job of the scientist, the experimental scientist, to eliminate variables. You can do experiments. You have to eliminate variables. Well, they eliminate. If you go to mainstream psychology departments, academic departments in colleges, they don't even recognize consciousness, let alone, I mean, nobody studies consciousness. Nobody studies what they call qualia, which is the sort of the epiphenomena of the central nervous system. Jung, through dreams and through studying the unconscious, found a new way of understanding the thing. All researchers, all psychologists, all scientists know the world through consciousness. So Jung said, well, if you don't understand consciousness, if you don't understand the psyche itself, then you don't even understand the instrument that you're using to observe the rest of the world. So anyways, I'm going on and on about the that's the importance of archetypes for Jung, and why. So yeah, they're pre-existing. They're things he observed in dreams, and there's certain indisputable ones. Anthony Stevens in the textbook has an excellent definition of archetypes, which I can't produce off the top of my head, but it basically means anything that appears cross-culturally in all cultures, in all times. We can pretty much say is archetypal. It's rooted in the central nervous system and the experience of the embodiment of human beings. So I'm gonna go. I hope that answers your question. That was Linda.
Yeah,
Linda, if that
kind of. Can I kind of follow that up a bit?
yeah, please, absolutely, yeah.
That's really interesting. So I'm just thinking about the fact that there's these kind of what I would call root archetypes that, strangely enough, have got some validation because of how they were generated. So ironically, you know, I mean, my experience of studying psychology and through college and all the rest of it is having been told that everything I was talking about was just not proper psychology. So I'm with you on that part of it.
Yeah, you bet.
But what do you think about the kind of plethora of what I would call modern archetypes that people kind of package up and sell and call a pack of archetype cards? And that, I mean, we're talking about apples and oranges, aren't we? Or are those just modern interpretations?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of different, people are motivated by a lot of different things that do these things for different reasons. There's I mean, a lot of that I'd call kind of top-down stuff, because it's more cognitive than what Jung was interested in was what's emerging out of the psyche.
Yeah.
And I mean, some of those things, some of those products and things you talk about can be useful in understanding symbols. First of all, what those people are describing are not archetypes. They're symbols. They're symbols of archetypes. They're no one. See, that's why Jung continued to say that archetypes were a hypothesis, because no one's ever seen an archetype. You've only seen the epiphenomena. You've only seen the symbols that emerge and the patterns of symbols that emerge. And from that, he sort of deduces that there are archetypes. That's his kind of working thesis. He was willing to say that there might be something else going on, but that was the best he had at that time. Since that time, there's been so much work in ethology and in, so I say people like Anthony Stevens and, Anthony Stevens in his book, The 2 Million-Year-Old Self, goes through a whole list of, and this is a relatively old book, there are even more things now, but list of things that back up Jung's theory of archetypes. But again, what you're describing is people who, like, for example, a deck of cards, a tarot, or all those are all symbols. Yeah. And at the core of them, there may be an archetype that sort of generated that, but those are not the archetypes, or the symbols. Okay. Yeah, does that help?
That's really helpful. Yeah, thank you.
Good, sure. Thanks, Linda, for the question. And I'm sure that I could say a lot more about that, but I want to make sure I address what other people think. Where can I sign up for this course? Is there a link? There sure is, Leah. My email address is james.r.newell@gmail.com. It's james.r.newell@gmail.com. And if you want to email me, I'll send you the links. Links are also available on the Depth Psychology Alliance. That's www.depthpsychologyalliance.com. It's there's lots of places. Oh yeah, someone put down where you could find it. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Newell. You're welcome. Such an excellent point. As a psych grad student, I thought it was foundational primary issue of instrumentation. It was like being among astronomers who never would like to even speak. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think you're talking about what I was saying about the instrument that people use to observe things. Yeah, it's quite fascinating that people don't go any further. That's all in the chat. Does anybody have any thoughts, questions, discussion points, observations? I appreciate you all sticking around so long. I hope you enjoyed what I had to say. Hope we'll see you. We've got some thank yous. Thank you all. If there's no more questions, I'm just going to say thanks, and I will hopefully see you around campus somewhere. Any other questions? Oh,
I just want to say thank you. Usually when somebody does a beginning thing like this, you get no information. And I really appreciate everything you had to say. Thank you.
oh, thank you. I'm glad you appreciate it. Thanks. And this will be available on YouTube if you want to send it to your friends, and it will also be on the Depth Psychology Alliance and all that. So thank you all. Thanks for coming. And there also, we have other, introductory classes on other topics that you can find on our YouTube channel on Depth Psychology Alliance YouTube, but the Depth Psychology Alliance YouTube channel. So thanks, everybody. Take care.